Um, all right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. And I'm Bodong Chan. I am one of the co-directors of the Learning Informatics Lab at CEHD. And thank you so much for joining today's webinar featuring Dr. Noah Weeth Feinstein from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this webinar is part of the a series this semester, Learning in a Post-Truth World, organized by our lab, especially because given the time we're in, the epistemic climate in such a interesting world right now, I find this topic so relevant and so important for educators, for every citizen in this country and in this world. So I want to say a few words before I will hand it over to David Dilemma to introduce our speaker. And for now, I want to mention a few words about the Learning Informatics Lab that was established in 2019 within our college. And basically our lab is interested in convening colleagues from different departments, different colleges, different universities to explore the intersection among research design and also technology and information systems, so that we can come together to think of ways to improve learning across lifespan. Part of the way we're doing that is by hosting a lot of thought-provoking speaker series and webinars. Today is one of them, so that we can get to know each other and we can make connections, and hopefully in the future we can work together on projects or other type of partnerships. I will paste a link to our lab website in a minute, and so that you can get a sense of our members and work we're doing. And then feel free to reach out to either me or the other co-director, Pani Kandio, who's also in the webinar. So with that, I want to hand over to David Dilemma to introduce our speaker today.
Wonderful, thank you, Bodong. I am truly honored to get to introduce our speaker today, Noah Feinstein. Dr. Feinstein is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin, where he studies the intersection between science and our personal, social, and political lives. Dr. Feinstein is one of the leading voices when it comes to understanding how truth and knowledge are experienced in people's everyday lives. This has meant centering environmental and sustainability education in his research, and it has meant thinking about how informal learning spaces such as museums can provide context for growth in these important areas. Having read Dr. Feinstein's work over the past decade or so, I am always struck by how practically and realistically he studies human learning. While many educational researchers might assume that expert disciplinary practices are of course the way forward, Dr. Feinstein has challenged that assumption to think in fresh ways about what truth and knowledge mean in our everyday, day-to-day experiences. For all of these reasons, when my Learning Informatics Lab colleagues and I started to organize this speaker series on the post-truth era, we knew that we needed to reach out to Dr. Feinstein, and we're absolutely thrilled to hear that he could join us. We're also looking forward to learning from you today. So please, everyone, join me with emojis and chat messages in welcoming Dr. Feinstein.
Thanks, everybody. For the seminar series that I lead, I often encourage people to do jazz hands, but not everyone's into that. Thank you for having me here as we approach the end of this strange and uniquely exhausting year. I say only partially in jest that preparing this presentation feels like the first research-related task I've undertaken in quite a while, as it's been a nice break from grading and service, and I'm enormously grateful for that alone. Following that gracious introduction, I'm not going to offer anything resembling an autobiography, but there's one piece of positionality that I think helps to understand my perspective, and that I think I think about myself as a scholar of science and technology studies. So one role that I have here at UW is that I'm the director of the Robert and Jean Holtz Center for Science and Technology Studies. And it's an interdisciplinary field, which is made up of people who study the place and the embeddedness of science in society in all sorts of different ways. And I think of myself as an STS scholar who focuses on problems related to education and learning. Some of the foundational premises of this work are deeply grounded in STS, and they can seem intuitive to STS scholars, even when they're not at all obvious to people outside of that field. So hopefully I'm giving enough background and grounding in my general claims, but if I'm not, then you should go ahead and post a question in the chat. I'm juggling windows a little bit, so I may not see it right away, but if I don't, I'll definitely try to come back to it at the end. And I appreciate your patience with that. So I'm grateful also for this invitation to reappraise an article that was written prior to the remarkable, to put it kindly, events of the past 15 months. The pandemic, obviously, but also the breathtaking collapse of any remaining consensus on political reality. It's safe to say that this is not a paper that I hoped would become more relevant, but it has. And in some respects, let's see if I can advance my slide here. Some of the flippant tone with which I initially approached this topic has not aged all that well. This is a cover slide from an ARA presentation in 2018, at which point I was pretty convinced that the post-truth era was a difference of degree, but not of type, from the struggles over truth and credibility that have characterized our society, and that people like John Dewey and Walter Lippmann have written about for 100 years. However, things do appear to have gotten worse, and there may indeed have been a shift of type as well as a shift of degree. Now, of course, even at the time that I was first writing, there was considerable anxiety about decaying truth norms, as exemplified by this slide, this cartoon showing the previous press secretary, Sean Spicer. But I do think it's safe to say things have gotten worse. And on the partisan politics front, Trumpian accounts of the presidential election have shattered the remaining institutional safety glass. But of greater concern for us, perhaps, is the social and epistemological dumpster fire of COVID-19, what some have been tempted to call and have called the infodemic. So let me give you a glimpse about what I'm going to cover in this talk. And then I'll plunge in and we'll see how far we get. What I'm planning to do is conduct a reappraisal of some ideas which I laid out along with a colleague, David Waddington, a philosopher of social science and education. And I'll do this by providing an overview of some of the key points from 2020 paper, Individual Truth Judgments or Purposeful Collective Sense-Making, which deliberately addressed some of the major quandaries of the post-truth era. I understand that some of you have read this paper, and these arguments may be familiar to you. Hopefully it won't be entirely redundant to hear me give voice to them. But as I go along, I'll also be reconsidering those arguments in a fairly informal manner in light of the dumpster fire of the COVID-19 pandemic. For me, this represents a remarkable stress test of ideas that were put forward with an entirely different set of examples in mind. The extra theoretical story of this paper is that I didn't really want to write about science literacy anymore. That's something I've been doing for a lot of years. But I was really interested in writing about climate change. And I was really interested in collaborating with Professor Waddington. And when I got the offer to participate in this project, this paper was part of a special issue project. I agreed in part because I thought it would be a chance to write about climate change. And all of this stuff, of course, is relevant to climate change. But The pandemic provided it with a stress test of unusual immediacy, which is an excellent tool and a prompt for reflection for anyone who writes about issues of public knowledge, science literacy, knowledge and truth in society, and so forth. All of us who do that work should be busily taking notes on our own lives, because rarely have our own lives provided such vivid examples and such vivid tests of our ideas. Where I'm going to end up is with some ideas which are very much works in progress, that are attempts to respond to this question, which is, how does our experience of the pandemic era, the various crises associated with the pandemic, change our understanding of the problem of science education, in particular in the post-truth era? Now, I should say, I typically speak most directly to a science education audience, because that's my training, and it's the problem that I'm most concerned with, the set of problems I'm most concerned with within education. You'll see me wave my hands at some other educational literatures, for instance, social studies education, and the work of Diana Hess, the dean of our School of Education here. But oftentimes they refer back to science education, and I always appreciate it when people who attend my talks can make connections out from that and tell me how this stuff plays, how it's more or less obvious, more or less relevant in fields outside of the fields that I consider to be my home territory. I am aware that you all bring a formidable set of expertise, a diverse interdisciplinary set of expertise to this topic as well. And I'm curious, as you listen to this talk and as we get a chance to talk about it afterwards, how you feel that learning analytics can support the design and implementation of education that is both socially complex and epistemologically robust. Because I think that the key challenge that we face is not trading off one of those for the other. In fact, I think they have to go together. And I'll develop that theme a little more as the talk goes on. But let's pause first and talk a bit about the post-truth era, because it is a complex and I think a highly subjective phenomenon. And it helps to have some shared idea of what it is that we're talking about. I'm going to talk about the characteristics of the post-truth era first, because that is how we came to know it. And as is so often the case in both science and social science, we perceive a phenomenon first, and then we try to figure out how it happened. So vast volumes of material have been written on the post-truth era, and there are divergent perspectives on what actually it is. But here are some things which come up a lot in that literature. We can define the post-truth era as, and this references an OED, Oxford English Dictionary definition, an era in which emotion, bias, and personal conviction crowd out rationality and objectivity, and implicitly expert evidence and knowledge. There's a lot in this quote, and I would take issue with some of it for reasons that you'll see later on. But this is a very common way of expressing people's experience of the post-truth era. But it's not the be all and end all, because there are other things that are sort of characteristic experiences of the post-truth era. And one of them is that the post-truth era is characterized by public figures casually lying or brazenly disregarding evidence, violating the tacit norms of political discourse in which, as another scholar said, politicians have to pretend to care when they're caught lying, or at least have to try to seem truthful according to shared standards of what constitutes truth. Another common experience of the post-truth era, and a common way in which it's described, is as an era in which false, unsubstantiated, or deliberately deceptive stories spread through news and social media channels. So there's a lot else that we could say about the post-truth era, but these are three things that you will all have heard before, and they are the experiences which frame the educational responses that I'm going to be talking about. Now, how we got into this mess is a whole different set of questions, and unfortunately, it's a very hard set of questions to test, because we can't, there's no counterfactual. We can't take the country back 10 years and then run the simulation again. But there have been a lot of hypotheses about what caused this particular set of circumstances, and some of the more common ones one of them has to do with technology. That technological changes that make it faster and easier to spread dubious information have exploited human characteristics, human ways of being, so that we haven't changed. We haven't become more gullible, more credulous as a people, although there's some people who argue that too, but rather that that we are less prepared individually and collectively as a society to deal with shifts in modes of communication, and that those modes of communication exploit certain weaknesses, we might call them, in the ways that we interact with each other. There's also, has been observed in many countries, a political rejection of expertise and technocratic governance. Sometimes this goes by the name populism. There are a lot of names for it. And oftentimes it's attributed to, at least in part to, the failure of elite policy actors to fulfill promises and to distribute the successes of a society when those successes exist in ways that are perceived as even, equitable, or fair. So according to some narratives, at least, the rejection of expertise has to do with the close association between expertise and political actors under what's sometimes called the neoliberal compromise of the 1990s and 2000s. Some people also attribute the post-truth era to cultural and structural shifts, such as income inequality, which have been extensively documented and which are expanding at an intranational and international scale, and have been for the past half a century, as well as increases in political polarization that can't be neatly attributed to a single cause themselves. Now, the post-truth era then is a complicated thing. It has complex plural characteristics, and it has complex plural causes. And all of those things create a sort of an ecosystem, a climate, which shapes the sense-making that all of us have to do as we go about our lives, our personal lives, our social lives, our civic lives. And it's very hard to avoid. It's surprisingly far-reaching. And as long as the post-truth era has occupied space in our cultural discourse, it's been a subject of interest in educational research. Now, we can all look back perhaps fondly on this era when we traveled to conferences. And I have very mixed response to it. I'm not entirely sure how much conference traveling I'm going to be doing in the future now that it's possible to do otherwise. But I do miss seeing people. And I vividly remember this conference, which was focused on post-truth. So it's clear that educators and educational researchers of various stripes believe that education has something to say about the post-truth era. But it's worth pausing, as Professor Waddington and I do in the paper at the very beginning, to say, what can education really do about the post-truth era? What's the scope for solutions that we are proposing and that we think is possible? And this is particularly important because I think it's critical to avoid what I see as a very familiar neoliberal theme, which is, let's fix institutional failures and structural problems with individual responsibility. So you can see this play out a lot. So for instance, when social safety nets fail, neoliberal policy programs tend to promote things like better individual saving or more contributions to charity or things like that. And that's a common theme for those who aren't familiar with neoliberalism as an idea, as a conceptual framework for analyzing social phenomena. One of the common things that neoliberal policies do is they take places where institutions have failed, where there's structural changes, and say, okay, who's responsible for the solutions? Individuals are responsible for the solutions. So there's some things that education can't do, at least not directly. Education can't regulate social media. Education cannot enact policy to increase public accountability of elected officials by doing electoral reform, for instance. Education can't prevent malicious foreign or domestic misinformation campaigns. And education can't, certainly by itself, eliminate income inequality. And if all those things have, to a greater or lesser degree, contributed to the post-truth era, as some people believe they have, yes, I agree. The individual solution does sound kind of absurd, but it's amazing how many people persist in it. I think my point here is that we need to be humble as educators and educational researchers about what education can actually do. All that said, education does have a role. And what that role is, I would argue, is to provide people with more effective coping tools for managing in this baffling, bewildering sense-making environment while we try to fix some profoundly broken institutions, to catch up with technological change, or perhaps more passively to wait for a new balance to emerge organically. I'm more on the activist side there. I think that we need to try to fix some of those structural problems, but hopefully the situation will change actively or passively. So what does all this have to do with science education, my home territory? I'm going to make some big generalizations here. So for those of you who are familiar with the territory, people in science education often get frustrated with the way that this portrayal sort of elides the complexity of the field. And it is a rich and complex field. So if you want to take issue with this, hold that until discussion, and I'm totally willing to engage about it and acknowledge that many of the criticisms are to some degree true. Science education can be split a lot of ways. And some ways of thinking about divisions within science education. One of them is the division between contextualist and internalist forms of education. Internalist forms of education focus on thinking like a scientist, how the scientific process works, and how we can get people to engage in it to create scientific knowledge. This is where a lot of American science education is these days. It is the principal guiding theme of the next generation science standards. And it's hard to throw a rock without hitting a curriculum or a curricular project of some sort that doesn't focus on thinking like a scientist and scientific practices in some way, shape, or form. The reverse of this, or I guess the counterpoint, is a contextualist perspective, which is a perspective that focuses more on science in society, science in life, how science plays out and affects us when we are not doing the work of scientists. And there's been a long dialogue back and forth in science education about the relative emphasis placed on one of these perspectives or the other. It's still there. It's always been there. I would argue that for a while now, we've been on an internalist kick that has to do with scientific practices and the idea of scientific practices. But there's always plural perspectives happening. There's another dimension to think about too, and this is the dimension between what we could think of as the individualist perspective and the sociocultural perspective. I'm sure every learning scientist in the room, in the virtual room, is familiar with this division. But a lot of social sciences are profoundly methodologically individualist. They focus on the individual as the unit of analysis. They assume that you can understand social phenomena through the lens of individuals and focusing on individuals almost exclusively. And that to the extent that broader levels are needed, it can be done by aggregating individuals, right? And in education over the past years, there has been a really useful injection of theory that draws our attention to sociocultural phenomena, the way that we can think about things that happen in the world as not being reducible to psychological properties, for instance, where you have to look at the relationships between people or things that they share, notions like culture, which are hard to capture by just looking at a single person, what a single person does, thinks, etc. Science education and education more generally, but science education specifically, tends to work in this quadrant, the individualist and internalist quadrant. It tends to focus on thinking like a scientist and on individuals, what individuals think and know and can do, even as it evokes this language of practices, which comes more from the sociocultural terrain, theoretically. I believe that one of the primary responses to the post-truth era has been something of a retreat into this territory, an intensification, where people are much more interested in talking about the epistemological superiority of scientific modes of thinking, encouraging people to think more deeply about thinking like a scientist, what that means, and how we can all replicate it, and how we'd all be better off if we replicated it in our daily lives. And also on individuals, as a way of trying to fend off or insulate people from what's seen as the corrupting influence of the social world. And I'll get into that more later. Professor Waddington and I made the argument in this paper that's a mistake. And that if we've gotten to the place where we are now by being primarily individualist and primarily internalist, why would we want to keep going in that direction? Shouldn't we try something else? And there are good reasons to believe that we should, I think. We argue that it's worthwhile to invest at least some curricular time in contextualist and sociocultural perspectives on science education, and thinking about how science gets out in society and how society gets into science, and thinking about how people do act and think together. So the central arguments of the paper are, first of all, that science doesn't offer us truth. It offers us pretty good knowledge. That sounds flip, but I'll get into it. The second one is that scientific knowledge doesn't offer ready-made solutions for either policy or personal action. And the connection between knowledge and action is complex and fragile. That anyone who tries to draw a direct line between what you know and what you're going to do has a bridge to sell you. And these are claims, this set of claims are very extremely well demonstrated and documented in other fields, but miraculously, some of that stuff doesn't make it into science education, at least not quickly or thoroughly. The third claim is that sense making is unavoidably social. That you can think about things as being individual or social as alternate perspectives, that you can think about individual action, you can think about somebody voting or reading a newspaper article, but that your choice to see that as individual is an analytic choice. It's not a phenomenological choice. When somebody votes, the action that they're taking is the result, it's the tip of the social iceberg, which involves their participation in social and cultural processes. The same is true for reading a news article, or sharing that news article, or accessing that news article through social media, which is how so many people get their news these days, as we now know. So, in thinking about the contrast between individualist internalists on the one hand and sociocultural contextualist on the other hand, I make an argument in the paper, which is that retreating to individual and internal modes of science education in the face of these challenges is kind of like abstinence-only education. It's a science education equivalent of abstinence-only sex education. It satisfies a moral and aesthetic urge to provide a clear picture of right and wrong. But in doing so, it ignores the complex social and epistemological reality of life and leaves students unprepared for the challenges they're going to face. So, as we know from extensive research in public health and other fields, abstinence-only education doesn't work. At least it doesn't work as well as other forms of sex education. So the question is, do we place more weight on wanting to have a morally satisfying form of education, an aesthetically satisfying form of education, or do we want to try something which is actually going to prepare people for the challenges they're going to confront? We argue that science education should, at least part of the time, focus on interventions that ask people to work in heterogeneous groups to make real decisions under conditions of uncertainty in which science doesn't provide neat solutions. Circumstances that, in other words, are more like the rest of life outside of school. So what I'm going to do now is walk through the claims of the paper. So a really good question has been asked in chat, which is that would you consider any of the other two quadrants also progress or trying something new or insufficient? This is a really good point. One of the critiques of the paper that we got when we were writing it and that we think is totally valid is that that we tend to associate, to sort of lead together the contextualist and the sociocultural perspective on one hand and the individual internalist perspective on the other hand. And honestly, all quadrants should be occupied, and all quadrants are somewhat occupied in science education today. But those perspectives tend to travel with each other. And for reasons that I hope will become clear in the rest of the paper, you will see why the contextualist and the sociocultural perspective tend to fit together. At least I hope you will. And we can come back to that in discussion afterwards. So let's talk through some of these propositions and see how they fare under the stress test of the present dumpster fire. So first of all, there's this notion that science doesn't quite offer truth. So Anyone in science education is familiar with premises like scientific knowledge is robust, but it's dynamic and tentative. Unfortunately, when these sort of platitudes about science encounter complex situations, they can produce cognitive dissonance. They can seem inadequate as descriptions of what scientific knowledge does and doesn't do. In reality, the pretty good knowledge that science provides doesn't approach either truth in the philosophical sense, foundational truth, or truth in the colloquial sense, the ways that we tend to think about truth. So using the word truth to describe scientific knowledge is setting yourself up for an experience of disappointment or a mismatch between what scientific knowledge does and what we sometimes want it to do. So science education knows that this mismatch exists, at least in theory, but it tends to lose sight of it when dealing with challenges. So you'll read about scientific knowledge being tentative and dynamic and all that stuff when you read about people researching the nature of science or scientific epistemology. But when they talk about things like combating misinformation or pseudoscience or creationism, then all that stuff tends to go out the window. And it's applied very unevenly depending on the topic of discussion. Whereas in practice, it's in those contexts where the epistemological basis, the truthness of science is being challenged, that we really need to reappraise the use of truth in thinking and talking about what scientific knowledge offers. So overstating scientific certainty creates room for the strategy that has been most vividly described by Naomi Oreskes and colleagues in her work on emergence of doubt, which is basically when you portray scientific knowledge as being too uncertain, then you create an opportunity for people to refute or cast doubt on policies based on consensus science because it's not certain enough. And some people think that this argument about truth versus pretty good knowledge is silly and academic, but that strategy, the emergence of doubt strategy, has been used repeatedly and successfully throughout history. It was used with lead in pipes, it was used with cigarettes, and it's been used with climate change, and so on and so forth. It should make us think twice about the way that we present certainty and the way that education presents certainty in overly simplistic ways. So this is the argument we made. How does it look today? Well, on the one hand, it looks way more obvious than before, right? So all of us have encountered the changeability of scientific knowledge in a way which is normally reserved for people who have rare diseases, right? So all of us are encountering these situations where scientific knowledge, which is of direct relevance to our lives, is changing fast and under our feet, and we have to deal with that. So for instance, most recently, there's been highly publicized results of meta-analysis on droplet versus aerosol transmission of COVID-19. This is a big deal, and policies were set around this, and it changed. Washing hands is probably less important. You don't need to wipe down your groceries. But for a long time, people thought that you did, and they thought that those were effective means of preventing infection. Also recently, vaccines and blood clots. This is another issue where the knowledge that we're facing is changing really fast, and it's incredibly controversial and incredibly consequential. And it's very hard to get the messaging right. And this is the other thing that emerges from living through the pandemic, is that striking the right messaging balance and talking about scientific uncertainty from multiple audiences is really hard. And that's a challenge that we need to deal with. And abstract characterizations, talking about things like scientific knowledge is robust but tentative, are not going to adequately capture that complexity of when and how scientific knowledge is reliable or not reliable. Next premise. So here's the notion that scientific knowledge doesn't bring us ready-made solutions. Education is often really concerned about what people know, but we do make a lot of references to what people do as well. And in practice, we care a lot about what people do and decide as much as what they believe. So think about climate change, or think about wearing masks. We care a lot about the actions that people take, And to some degree, I would argue, we're willing to accept the actions regardless of the beliefs that they have underlying those actions, if they take actions that we believe cohere. So it's also true that scientific knowledge can't be neatly converted into policy. And there are many, many examples of this, and COVID-19 has given us a host of them. So I'll give you a couple in a second. But let's take for granted for a moment that scientific knowledge doesn't lead neatly to policy solutions, because values enter in, constraints enter in, practicality enters in, all of these things enter in. Also, oftentimes policy problems are defined in the same terms as scientific questions. When it comes to personal action, values, attitudes, and most critically, structural context have enormous impact on the relationship between knowledge and action. So consider personal choices like, do I grocery shop? Do I try to get childcare? Do I continue going to work? All of these things have to do with your knowledge, but they also have to do with a lot of other things. Like, is there any other way to get food? Can you provide a safe home environment for your child and earn income at the same time? Can you afford to stop going to work if your work is a health risk? So all of this is to say, the COVID-19 dumpster fire has made this conclusion, if anything, more obvious than before. It has illustrated this through the policy level debates about herd immunity. So there have always been arguments that, that societies should let the virus run rampant, and that's the fastest way to achieve herd immunity. That may be true. Whether the cost of that is morally, socially acceptable, bearable by societies without breaking them, that is a different question. More recently, we've had fights, many, many fights about when and how to open schools. And science can't provide us with the entire answer to this question. It can tell us what happens if you do and don't open schools to some approximation. But whether those decisions are made one way or another and how they're made has a lot to do with the differing needs and values of the communities that are making them. And all these personal choices about risk, the wiping down the groceries, the going to the grocery store, the going to work, the seeing your grandmother. So all of this is more obvious, but also, if science has seemed less sufficient than ever, it has also rarely felt more necessary. And something that the pandemic drives home is that all of these claims, all these arguments about how science doesn't provide a complete solution can sometimes distract from the fact that science continues to have value in these personal, civic, political decisions that we make. And so how do we square that circle? How do we talk about the necessity, but not the sufficiency? Finally, sense-making is unavoidably social. So the argument here is that people encounter science as members of their social groups. This is true across political and demographic groups, and it's also true for scientists. And furthermore, this can't be reduced to irrational distortions of the world. So for instance, African-American people have good historical and contemporary reasons to distrust the institutions of biomedicine. Women in many countries have greater levels of environmental concern. And in many contexts, they're also subject to greater environmental hazards. Appreciating a claim, a knowledge claim, interpreting the body language of a scientific institution through the lens of your social group is not merely a matter of distortion. It also reflects real experience, concrete knowledge, the weight of history and structural inequality in our societies. People also, and we know this very well, encounter science and health information through their social networks. It's increasingly the primary channel through which people encounter, and that does take into account social media, but it's always been true of people's in-person social networks as well. And this has been documented through social network analysis of various sorts. And finally, people make sense of science together, which can be productive or problematic. The National Academy's report from 2016 says, quote, resources are distributed and organized in such a way that the varying abilities of community members can work in concert to contribute to their overall well-being. That's just a fancy way of saying there are circumstances, there are many powerful examples of non-scientists working together to develop sophisticated knowledge and achieve personal and political goals. Of course, obviously, there are echo chambers and filter bubbles as well. So all of this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic probably seems more obvious than before. It's pretty clear that institutions are political in the sense that they are treated politically. That something like the CDC, in the way that it's governed, in the way that claims emerge from it, in the way that it receives and processes information, even within science, to the extent the CDC is within science, is highly political. Perceptions of risk and the severity of the pandemic have varied widely. They varied geographically, they varied politically, and they varied by cultural and demographic group as well. And today, we see an incredible partisan, and we're now seeing a gender gap in vaccine hesitancy. So clearly, social, cultural, demographic factors influence how we encounter information, how we make sense of it, and how we choose to weigh it. All of this is true. And also, it's also increasingly clear that the self-sorting processes that run rampant in our society today, self-segregating processes, reinforce differences and exaggerate the antagonism which we feel. And science is developing partisan associations. Now, if you, as a political partisan, have ever claimed that your party is the party of science, or you as a member of a cultural group have ever put a yard sign in your yard that says, in this house, we believe that science is real, you're making an assertion about what cultural groups and what political groups science belongs to and belongs with. And in the long run, those assertions might be culturally dangerous. So how does this change the picture? How does this change the problem? I would argue many of the conclusions, the basic premises of the paper seem quite solid under these intense dumpster fire conditions that we're all dealing with. These premises seem more obvious than they did before. And the basic conclusion that we need to deal with this social mess in the context of science education, that also seems solid. Yet the scope and the nature of the challenge is clearer. It seems clear to me that we need better ways to teach about the strengths and limitations of scientific knowledge. We've known about this problem for a long time. The old nature of science premises that scientific knowledge is tentative. We can't stop there anymore. This is a bottomlessly complex issue, and we need to deal with it with respect, with appropriate respect, as I'll get into in a minute. We also need better ways of teaching about why and how and when science is important. We can no longer rest on the notion that science is important, because sometimes it's not. And differentiating between the circumstances when science can and can't help is going to make a difference, perhaps, we hope. Finally, I think we need collaborative educational tasks in which science is a force for coherence rather than a point of division. Now, I have a little more to say about each one of these points, and I'm aware that it's about quarter of. Is it productive for me to continue talking about these points a little bit, or should we stop and open the discussion?
My sense, and others feel welcome to chime in, is that it would be great to hear you riff on these a little bit.
Okay, let's do it. Let's do it. Okay, so first of all, two of my arguments I want to say are primarily arguments about framing, but they're arguments about framing that lead to some technical and practical suggestions, or what I hope are at least the beginnings of technical and practical suggestions. The first thing I think we need to do is I think we need to throw out trust. I think the word trust and the framing of trust and trust in science is wholly inadequate to deal with the social miasma that we're stuck in. And I would suggest that a superior frame is appropriate respect. So let me give you an example of the way that trust is analyzed in public understanding and public engagement with science, and is talked about often in the science education literature. Here's a trust in science instrument that asks people, indicate the extent to which you would agree or disagree, imagine a Likert scale with each of these premises. 1, science and technology make our lives healthier, easier, and more comfortable. 2, science and technology can solve nearly any problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these simplistic assessments of trust are going to produce cognitive dissonance when people encounter the complexity of how science is and isn't trustworthy, and how that changes over time and from one topic to another. I think that it's better to replace a unidimensional quantity, even a quantity that has a couple of perhaps principal components, with a quality that we allow to vary by context. I think appropriate respect is a good starting place to think about this. I think we need to acknowledge that people have good reasons not to trust, like the vastly higher rate of infant mortality among African Americans, or the undeniably problematic involvement of pharma in the clinical trial process. I think that we need to acknowledge that trust is, and it should be, socially situated and context dependent. Rather than asking, do you trust science? We should be asking questions like, when and under what circumstance can you rely on scientific knowledge? Now, there's a lot which has been written on this, and I know you've heard from Clark Chin, and his work with Sarit Barsalai is a wonderful starting place on this stuff. Their extremely elaborate multi-part framework on apt epistemic performance has started to tackle some of the nature of what it looks like to think about appropriate respect for science. This frame doesn't come from them. I think it's a useful one for capturing some of what they're after, the idea of appropriate respect for science. I would also suggest that for those who are really interested, it's worth digging deeper into the science education literature, going a generation back and reading the truly prescient work of a man named Stephen Norris, who unfortunately passed away several years ago. This article from 1995 on learning to live with scientific expertise, even though he uses the word trust, really anticipates so much of what we're dealing with today. It's a brilliant article, as is much of Stephen's work. So that's the first frame. The second reframe, I think we need to focus less on truth and more on value. Because what does relying on scientific knowledge mean? If I'm suggesting that appropriate respect means asking when and how you can rely on scientific knowledge, what does that mean? Here, and in response to the challenge of teaching about why and how science is important more generally, I would suggest in all earnestness that we take the posts and post-truth seriously, that we stop thinking and talking so much about truth and we start talking about value. My point here is that we should start with the premise that scientific knowledge is sometimes necessary, but rarely sufficient for good decision-making. And that instead of presuming the relevance of science and arguing in a blanket way for the relevance of science, as science education tends to do in claiming that science is, or STEM, we might say now, is relevant to all aspects of life, we might start with the questions, what value does science have here? In this case, and this would need to be comparative, obviously, over time. What does science tell me about the outcome spaces for different choices? And critically, what does science not tell me? Assessing the value of scientific evidence, the value of scientific evidence is not trivial. It's a skill that has to be practiced, and to practice it in earnest, I think we also have to entertain situations in which the answer to what value has science is not much. The goal can't be to convince students that science is always useful and helpful, because it's not. I'm going to do a slightly obnoxious thing here, which is quote myself. This is a quote from the paper Salvaging Science Literacy from 2011, 10 years ago now, good Lord, which is that it follows from a definition, the idea of a competent outsider, which I outline in that paper, that the pursuit of science literacy is not incidentally, but fundamentally about science relevance, about identifying relevance. And that learning to see how science is or could be significant or of value, as I'm arguing here, is one of the most important things that you can develop. One of the most important skills that you can develop through education. Finally, and this is, I guess, less of a framing suggestion and more of a conceptual one. I think we need to learn to, I think we need to teach people to use science as a boundary object. And so what's a boundary object? This is a concept from science and technology studies. A boundary object is something that has different meanings in different social worlds, but their structure is common enough to more than one world to make it recognizable, and therefore a means of translation, a means of collaboration. Sociologists came up with this idea, and the notion is that there are some things, some concepts, sometimes even some material objects that people in different social groups think about differently, they perceive differently, but they both care about, they both invest in that thing here, science, scientific knowledge. And that even though they interpret it differently, their mutual investment in that provides a platform for collaboration. So in order for this to work, we have to start with the notion that not all socioscientific topics are politically polarized. So several years ago, when I was on a consensus committee for the National Academy's report on science literacy, Dan Kahan came to give a presentation to the committee on cultural cognition and science policy. And he made the point that most science is not polarizing at all, but that the moment an issue gets drafted into a partisan struggle, attitudes are attached to different underlying values and rapidly produce what the commentator Andrew Hoffman calls a logic schism, where people seem to be talking about the same thing, but they are not. So when somebody talks about masks, what are they talking about? So not all socioscientific topics are polarized. It's increasingly common, but let's assume there are cases where it's easy to find common cause. And let us imagine that deliberative capacity, and this is the work of social studies educators like Diana Hess, can be developed. That you can develop the capacity to work across political divides and political differences through practice in educational contexts. And we can imagine then a developmental trajectory in which students start working on cases where common cause is easy to find. And in those cases, they establish science as an object of mutual investment, a thing that people care about enough, so that when you move into more politically complex cases, places where partisan perspectives diverge, then you can maintain that boundary object, science, scientific knowledge, as a thing that both sides, all sides, are invested in and can use to coordinate their conversations rather than as a wedge to divide them. Now that's some heady stuff which needs further practical development. And all of this stuff is really just starting places. But I hope it will be provocative for conversation. Here's a list of some other stuff I've written on the topic over the past decade or so, including a recent chapter on public knowledge and environmental topics, which I think is of value here. I can tell you that what I'm thinking about next is the notions of collective science literacy. Despite my best efforts, apparently I'm back to writing about science literacy. And with that, I'll stop and take some questions. Okay, there's some stuff in the chat, which I've probably missed.
No,
Okay.
This was an absolutely stellar talk. Please feel welcome to respond to any comments in the chat. And I also want to note that Noah wanted to open the floor to graduate students first for questions. And I think it's a wonderful idea. And I'd like to respect that. So please, graduate students who are in attendance, feel welcome to post questions in the chat as Noah plays catch up. And also please, share, open your mic and feel welcome to ask your question as well.
Yeah. So I think I've touched on the stuff in the chat, at least touched on it. So let's take some new questions. And if you feel like I haven't touched on it enough, you can bring it up again. This is a sign that I talk too fast. Questions? Oh, not familiar with the term boundary concepts. So there's a lot that's been written here, and this is an interesting idea, and there's a divergence between STS and the field of educational research, where I'd say boundary objects is such an old concept in science and technology studies that people have now they're layers of critique. People have talked about boundary objects and boundary organizations and what is or isn't about whatever. So it's complicated. But the bottom line, and here's another way of thinking about it. The notion of boundary objects comes in part from anthropological study, from ethnographic study. Another way of thinking about it is Peter Gallison's notion of trading zones, in which you imagine contact between cultures who are interested in trading something. And what one culture has to offer may have different significance in another culture, right? Suppose you want to trade metal object, and the metal object is common in your culture. It's a commodity in your culture, but it's a rarity in another culture, and it achieves a particular significance. Or suppose you want to trade a particular plant, which has medicinal significance in one culture and ornamental significance in another culture. Those things, those objects of trade, those are boundary objects. They're things that both cultural groups care about. And the trade itself becomes a boundary object, right? Because it is a thing that both people are invested in, both people are engaged in, they both get something out of engaging with it, right? You have to accept that what they get out of it is different. And the way that they interpret what happened in any social interaction may be a little different. But because they both care about the trade, they stay connected to each other. And so the metaphor that I'm trying to make here is that if you can get people to feel like science is relevant to the problems that matter most to them, that scientific knowledge has something to say to the problems that matter most to them, to their greatest concerns, then they will stay invested in conversations about scientific knowledge, even when there are conflicts over what that knowledge has to offer, right? But I think you need to start by firmly establishing that science speaks to those very different concerns, rather than focusing on the ways that science is a wedge issue. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. Other questions? I know there was some stuff that wasn't clear in there because I wrote that presentation. So it's okay to say, hey, I didn't get that, or hey, I'm not sure I buy that. Or you said this like it was self-evident, but it doesn't seem self-evident to me. Those are all totally fair things to say.
All right, I'm not sure how good my audio will be because I'm outside. But I'm curious why in this conversation of boundary objects, you're placing science as the boundary object. There's different, I mean, you know all this. There's different epistemological approaches that are different from science that answer the same questions. So why not center the concern, whether it's foodways and GMOs or fertilizers or climate change? Why have science be the boundary object that you're proposing?
That's a really good question. I'm honestly not entirely sure that it's the right frame. So for instance, in my work on climate change, I've gotten really interested in adaptation because I find that there are many more people who are interested, many more politically diverse groups that are interested in talking about adaptation to environmental variability or whatever they want to call it, in ways that are effectively conversations about climate change and that lead to a whole range of other conversations. So that's a conversation which decenters science and centers something else instead. The reason why I wanted to try out this argument, and it's a new one, so maybe it's not going to hold water over time, is because of a sense that just as expertise has become a wedge issue in our society, I think that it's entirely possible that science would also become a wedge issue, increasingly become a wedge issue. And then I think that if you're going to talk about the value of science to one's personal civic decisions, if you're going to talk about appropriate respect for science, you need to maintain science as something which is valued across different cultural lines. And one of the consequences of that might be that people of very different groups, of very different political leanings, might maintain an investment of science as a, if not a neutral territory, at least a common ground, sort of a treaty table around which parties might gather when things get heated. So like for me, a very good outcome is an outcome, and let's imagine this outcome in which you have politically and culturally diverse group of discourse participants in an exercise of some sort. And they're arguing and fighting about the policy options. And then parties on different sides simultaneously say, okay, let's look at what the scientific evidence says about what might happen if we do this policy or we do this policy, right? If you have people saying, using that as the place where they're coming together, rather than a cudgel that one side used to beat the other side with, then I think that that has the potential to be valuable. Now, I'm really wary here because in the past, people have talked about this in terms of science being a neutral broker or a trusted broker. And that gets into issues of trust and neutrality, which I think are tired and don't do it. But I think that we need to develop educational strategies that encourage diverse groups to invest in the value of scientific evidence, even if it means different things to them. Does that make sense? I gotta be honest, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess if I were to rephrase back to you what I think I hear you saying, it's that in some ways science becomes the thing that everyone can point to as opposed to being associated with one side of the argument or one group of people coming in on a particular argument. And that because the interpretation of scientific results can be different for different groups of people, it places it instead of being the thing that one side owns, that one side is bringing with their own interpretation, it becomes the thing that dialogue happens around.
So here's a way to think about it, right? There's a slide that I wanted to make that I didn't have time to make, so forgive me. But it has to do with this notion of a developmental trajectory, right? And you see this in politics, right? So for many years, it's not entirely true anymore, but for many years, the notion of like funding cancer research was like the bipartisan thing. And every year there was this ratchet of money where every Congress wanted to put more money into cancer research because Congress people are mostly old and they're worried about cancer more than everyone is. And they really want cancer research to make progress, right? We all should. And so there are issues where we can say, what does science say? Where there isn't a clear partisan divide. And if you could categorize issues along a complex trajectory from like incredibly polarizing up here to relatively easy to find common ground down here, and you start your discourse exercises where you're talking about the value of scientific knowledge on topics where people can talk together about the value of scientific knowledge, you can build what used to be called a habit of mind, which is based around science as a place where we turn at a certain point in the conversation when we're thinking about one of the reasons why one might invest money or time or energy in this. Then you can get more complicated and hopefully it holds. Hi, Marjorie.
Hi, Noah. It's good to see you.
Good to see you
I have
too.
a question, but I don't want to interrupt the grad student.
It's okay, let's open it up.
Maybe instead of a question, a little bit of an interesting case to explore. So my name is Marjorie Biquette. I'm a researcher and evaluator at the Science Museum of Minnesota. I know several of you on this call, and Noah and I have known each other for a long time and done research studies together. At the Science Museum of Minnesota, we had masks that we started selling, but even before we reopened, that said in big block letters, "Trust Science" on them. And obviously this is a political act. It is a strong statement. We had very few complaints except one from a scientist who felt like this was putting science in the wrong place, I think for many of the reasons that you have been grappling with. And so I've been trying to rephrase that, and it has to fit on a mask and be legible. So if we are thinking about reframing science, thank you, Megan, for getting the link in there so quickly. How do we rephrase that slogan in order to push towards I forget your exact phrase, but appropriate respect. I don't think appropriate
That is the
respect for
phrase.
science is going to fit on there. Do we trust masks
Mhm.
and then throw out the inventory if the science changes? So how do we convey that message in a way that works?
So this is hard. And I think that part of the answer is that I don't think you can do a slogan. I don't think you can. I really don't. And I know that people always will. And that people's yard signs that say science is real are going to stay up in their yards, whatever the heck science is real means. And they reflect cultural affiliations, strongly held cultural affiliations. I think the problem with that mask, and I agree, David, it's a super interesting case study, is that trust science is seen as a desirably, from the perspective of the people saying it, they want it to be an apolitical statement. But when you put on a mask, it's political. So what that did, what the juxtaposition of that slogan with that material object did, was attempt to own science. It was an attempt by one political cultural group to own science. And I think in the long run, that's problematic.
I think it's also an interesting thing to look at in the context of a science museum that both wants people to understand and appropriately respect science, but also understand its historic shortcomings and the ways that, the exhibits that unpack the historic flaws of anthropology, for instance, really intentionally and deeply. And so it's a hard question.
Yeah, and for those who are not familiar, who are on the call, the Science Museum of Minnesota has been an absolute field leader in addressing issues like white supremacy in science, and putting that, and then being very bold about putting that stuff really in the headlines of the work that they do. And they're dealing with the reality that science is a cultural affiliation for many people. And so it's complicated when you feel very strongly and positively about science, to unpack some of that stuff. But that's why I like the frame appropriate respect. Honestly, I feel like respect is what we're after in the end, right? But respect has limits and it's contextual, right? You respect a tool, you want to use it in the circumstances where it's appropriate. I didn't mean to cold call you. I was just saying hi also. Other questions?
Noah, I would love to float one past you.
Sure.
When you envision science classrooms taking on difficult socio-scientific issues in heterogeneous groups, facing practical, taking into consideration practical, realistic concerns, does that start breaking down the wall of like science? And are you asking for science to blend with history, with mathematics, with other disciplines, and to, think of the appropriate respect or the blend between other approaches? Because at some point you're going to move very quickly outside of the bounds of the, the methods that were used to support the claim that you're considering in that science context. What does a school look like that tries to design for this and take this seriously?
Yeah. All right. So here's where I share probably an unpopular opinion, which is that I hate STEM. I hate the frame STEM. We're stuck with it right now, but I really dislike it. And I don't think STEAM helps. And here's why I don't like it. I don't like it because, well, what's good about it is it acknowledges the permeability of the border between science and technology and engineering and mathematics and how all those things are linked. That's great, fantastic, true. STS folks were talking about that for decades before it leaked into education. What I don't like is that it sort of presumes that there's some groupings that matter more than others, right? And since STEM became a dominant frame for thinking about science education, collaborations with social studies, for instance, history, political science, economics, geography, have become less obvious and lower priority. And those are the collaborations where I think this stuff lives. And this is why. There's some evidence on this. Some of this is anecdotal, but if you talk to social studies teachers tend to be very comfortable with diverse political opinions. That's their bread and butter. They expect that. And although not all of them are comfortable with dealing with controversy in their classroom, they recognize it as an important problem, right? With social controversy, with moral controversy, with value controversy. On the other hand, they shy the heck away from scientific evidence because that is not their thing. Science teachers, on the other hand, are very comfortable with scientific evidence, but they are very invested in a model of neutrality, what they often think of as neutrality, which makes them feel like they can't broach topics which are perceived as political. So the moment somebody says that's political, science teachers get nervous, and they should, just like the social studies teachers should, because they're not prepared for it, right? So this is an area where we need people working together. Unquestionably, it breaks down those barriers. And look, I don't know what is going to do that. Standards projects take forever. Curriculum projects take forever. The timescale of the post-truth era is fast. I'm not sure that we can get this into schools fast enough. It's why I think about museums. And lately I've been thinking a lot about co-curricular projects. There's an article that I assigned for my students, which is about the Girl Scouts. It's about Girl Scouts intervention on energy use. It's very behavior changing, which is not normally my thing. But buried in that article is the factoid that 50%, about half of American women participated in the Girl Scouts for a year or more in the course of their lives. That is an incredible figure. It's an incredible figure. I think co-curricular organizations can be very powerful. And I think that they have space to do stuff and sometimes are already really invested in practical community problem solving. So imagine a co-curricular organization that was school affiliated, but not curricular, which focused on community resilience in the face of climate change. You can do this stuff. You can do social studies and science at the same time in that context. So I could imagine an intervention like that taking shape. But if you want to design a school around it, that's great too. And hopefully, honestly, so I know that we're close to time. I want to circle back to something. One of the things which has impressed me enormously about data analytics as a field is I feel like there used to be these questions about interaction, about classroom interaction, that were black boxes that could not be explored. Complex social interaction, where you couldn't look at the ways that people were and weren't investing in particular topics and weren't responding to particular words because it was way too micro and it went by too fast. And now we can do that stuff. So when I thought about the opportunity to present to a data analytics group, a learning analytics group, what I feel like is so exciting is that this question of socially complex and epistemologically robust, this is where the money is, like in a conceptual sense, if not perhaps a literal sense, right? This is where those tools are so urgently needed, and where the tools are starting to be available. So hopefully I can convince you that if you're not working on that stuff, you should be.
Yeah, I hope it's okay to share very briefly. We have been thinking exactly along those lines that analytics could really show students how they're arriving at data sources, how their peers are arriving at data sources, how they're responding to it, to foster argumentation about how we're arriving at claims and how we're responding to them. Because there are traces of those actions, I really think that we could design to understand the heterogeneity of the socially complex routes, but take seriously epistemic concerns at the same time. It's a very vague response, but I really feel that opening is a really productive way to move forward.
Yeah. So I will say I don't tend to draw the line between public engagement with science and school. What I like to tell my students is that school is the most common venue for public engagement with science, because kids are public, right? We're all people. This is John Dewey's most profound and often overlooked message, is that, you know, school is not preparedness for life. School is life. And so in school, people are engaging with science in these complex ways. And outside of school, unless you're Facebook or Google, it's very hard to have the data to track the way that people engage with science over time. But in school, because you can set up circumstances, you can track them. And so I feel like not only is it a value for education qua education, there's enormous value to the study and understanding of public engagement with science that comes from the capacity to set up these circumstances and then watch how people engage with these topics in complex ways. I'm really excited about it. I'm possibly over-caffeinated too.
If we've all made it to nearly
Cheers.
5:30, we are as well. Bodong, I'm looking at you because you normally wrap us up. I know we're over a little bit. Noah, this was a riveting and stellar talk, and I know you have us all have the gears turning in all kinds of ways. So we can't thank you enough for joining us and sharing this talk. And thank you to everyone for participating as well and for sticking around.
It's a pleasure on my side, and hit me up, folks. I want to keep talking and thinking about this, and I think that there's a lot of room for all sorts of interesting collaborations. Be patient if my email response time is a bit slower than normal these days.